Welcome to everybody who has joined this webinar. I think there are probably many people joining us tonight who had a desire at some point to engage with Telepractice or Tele-AAC, and who very suddenly found actually it's something they have to do immediately. So I am really delighted that it's possible to offer this webinar focusing on exactly that, jumping into Tele-AAC, working with what you've got. And we're really privileged that tonight, two people who really have been pushing ahead with Tele-AAC, pioneering this area in many respects, Nerissa Hall and Hilary Jellison, are here to share their expertise with us. They're both co-founding members of Communicare, which is really, as I understand it, delivering AAC services remotely as their model of service delivery. So they have huge practical expertise that they've developed really with working with this model of service delivery. And in addition, they have very helpfully published what I think is the first textbook focusing on this area, Tele-AAC, Augmentative and Alternative Communication through Telepractice. And Paul, you have a copy of that you can hold up and share with the group. I suspect this will become the Bible for many people in the very near future. So both Nerissa and Hilary are very active members of ASHA's SIG 12. And some of you may even have had the opportunity to hear them speak in a webinar last week. But for those of you who have not had that opportunity, I think you're going to really enjoy this evening. Just to let you know how it's going to roll out, Nerissa and Hilary will be leading the webinar. You are free to ask questions to explain something, so clarification questions through the webinar. If you have other questions, please share them through chat, but we will not be answering those questions during this webinar. Instead, after the webinar, we will be collating those questions and getting responses that we can then share with everybody. Paul, through Pranky Romick, is recording the webinar, and once it has completed, he has offered to clean up some of the introduction pieces and any glitches that arise, and will then share the recording via YouTube, and we'll send a link to everybody so that you know you can go back. We're very conscious that many of the participants tonight do not speak English as their first language. So we hope the video will be helpful to you, particularly in working around some of those challenges of developing skills in a language that is not your first language. I think I've covered the housekeeping bits, Paul, have I?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to disappear for a bit because I discovered, because this is an international thing, I think we've landed in a lot of people's spam folders. So I'm going to send out another mail to the...
Okay.
Okay, I've disappeared.
And in the meantime, then, I'm just going to hand over to Nerissa and to Hilary, saying thank you again for your generosity in sharing your expertise with us this evening. And we're really looking forward to this.
Thank you. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to touch on Tele-AAC and really working with what you have and what the individuals that you're working with might have. So we're kind of taking a practical approach and touching on some of the basics. And as Martine mentioned, we'll also be available to address areas that need more specific information at another time as well. So what is Telepractice? It is really considered a model of service delivery, where services are provided at a distance, with the idea to link the individual with the clinician. When we think about Tele-AAC in particular, this is obviously really for individuals using AAC. And so it differs in the sense that we have the added component of needing to share information about an AAC system. And this can be by sharing a replica or a copy of it or other versions, but the distinguishing feature being that we need to share quite a bit of visual information in the tele environment. The other thing is that we need to support having eyes on the system. So we need to be able to have an idea of how the individual is using their AAC system, or how the communication partner, the family member or parent, is also using it. So we're going to touch on two major kind of categories of services. We have real-time services, which happen in the moment, like now, and we call these synchronous services. Or we have services that happen over time, and that is considered asynchronous. In general, Tele-AAC can involve many team members. What's unique about our current situation is that we have the opportunity to connect really closely with families and caregivers. But if we picture outside of this situation, you could also loop in occupational therapist or a physical therapist or a vision specialist. So it allows the involvement of a lot of people who can tune in, just like we are tuning in right now, to a particular session. We also know about the field that it can enhance our productivity, make it better by limiting the amount of travel time, and it can also adjust scheduling. People that may not have been able to have driven or transported themselves to a place could still tune in from their location. So there are a lot of benefits to the field of Tele-AAC in general. When we think about services, we can provide the same kinds of services in this remote virtual environment. So we can still do intervention services or treatment therapy services, assessment or diagnostic services, as well as consultation. They can occur in either that real time, or they can occur over time. And we'll talk about them more, but we also, by being careful with what kinds of technology we use, we can support hands-on work. We can be very creative with how we are working with the tools.
Nerissa, I just wanted to add back on the other slide, just to comment that we aren't currently doing any assessments through Tele. There's really the importance of needing to have a clinician on site or in person to be able to complete the assessment through Tele support.
Thank you for adding that. We'll talk quite a bit about technical complexity, and what is particular of Tele-AAC in general is that we have the tele technology, so the video conferencing, the cameras, but then we also have the AAC technology, and we have to try to keep them in balance so as not to take away from the session. So we talk quite a bit about trying to keep the technical complexity at bay or low, or at least initially when people are getting started, starting with easy to use options and then building up from there.
when we look at the privacy and security, this is a really important piece of it that we need to be aware of and we need to consider. Specifically looking at the General Data Protection Regulation compliancy, that's protecting all personal data. So really being aware of any of the information that we have that can relate or use to identify an individual person. Definitely refer to the local regulations on that piece of it, but something to include and be aware of, as well as thinking about the environmental considerations where we're at home, who is able to hear the session that you're having in your house, as well as who at the house that you're video conferencing into is able to hear that information, and just being careful of who can see, who can hear, as well as if you're recording that information, how are you recording it? How are you encrypting it? And most importantly, making sure that we're getting consent from the families, that they know what and how we're going to handle that sensitive information in that Tele-AAC session.
So we like to talk about candidacy. So we consider who is a candidate or a good fit for Tele-AAC. And we often suggest using like an intake survey, and we have a resource that we're happy to share that just gives examples, but basically taking inventory and finding out about who's involved, the individual and their communication partners, the environment in which the service is happening, what kind of technology is available on the side of the clinician as well as the individual, and how they prefer to connect, or what kind of way to connect, whether or not it's in real time or over time, what works better. Something that we, so I mentioned here that we go in specific about the teletechnology, the AAC technology, the environment, the communication partner, and the individual. And we have, probably hard to see, we're happy to share this with Martine and Paul. They can share it out as well, just an intake survey to help gather that information, to help us make the right decision from the clinician's end. But what we like to think about, it's almost similar to a feature matching process in AAC, like when just as we go through what are the features of the individual and what system best works with them. Similarly, it's almost like a feature matching for service delivery. We don't like to think of it, is someone a candidate, yes or no? It's more, how are we going to provide the service? And we want to talk a little bit about that.
When we take into, or when we're thinking about individuals using AAC, we really look at it as a three-way process for communication. There is the communication partner, there's the individual, as well as the AAC communication system. And so when we're doing that, we're considering the candidacy of that individual. How much modeling do they need? How much support with that co-construction of message is needed? And really thinking about how that is going to interplay into the Tele-AAC session. So when we're looking at that individual for, or the candidacy of the partner, we're looking at what is their comfort level with using AAC with that student? What is their comfort level with using the teletechnology? We have families we're working with who don't usually use the device at home, or aren't used to working with the student in that structured setting, or maybe terrified of the use of technology beyond their phone. And so we want to check in and see where that communication partner is, and we can use our own consultation support or training to bring that communication partner further along that continuum. But we need to know where they are so that we can meet them where they currently are to make that tele session successful for them as well. So when we look at the candidacy for Tele-AAC, it's more looking at what's the individual able to do on their own. If they're able to access their device fairly independently with little support from a communication partner, we're able to really look at direct synchronous Tele-AAC support. But if it's someone that's going to need a lot of co-construction, they may need some more support from a communication partner that's supporting them within that tele session.
So we like to think of it as a continuum of support. And it may be that for some goals or for some skill sets, we are able to work directly in that real-time synchronous environment, whereas for some other things, it might be better to work in that asynchronous environment. So maybe we share a video or a tutorial or a resource that they then try on their own, and then we come back and talk about it in real time. And people may move within one service delivery to another, that kind of model. And it's important to be flexible, especially if maybe the direct synchronous didn't work and the indirect, or even the working asynchronously may be better. The other thing that we think about is, for some, it takes time to build up the tolerance to the virtual environment. So maybe they start with a little bit of direct time and then work more on that consult. And then as they become more and more comfortable, they can tolerate a much longer session. We do like to encourage teams to be clear and transparent about what they feel can and cannot be done in a tele environment. They're just like Hillary had mentioned at the beginning, sometimes it's hard to really address access or elements of an AAC assessment without being able to be on site or have a very skilled partner in the on-site environment. But we would just be clear about that, and we would say, well, we can do this, but we can't do this, or this is what I hope to do, and I might adjust it if it doesn't work. So just being very clear. And as Hillary mentioned when talking about privacy and security, just providing information and getting consent to provide services in this manner is an important part to think about.
I think regarding the transparency before shifting over to equipment is trying to help the communication partner or the parent on the other end understand or help picture what Tele-AAC really is. For some of us in our minds, we picture Tele-AAC to be this huge, complex, fancy thing when it can be messy, and that's okay, or it could be very simplistic and be successful. So the more we can be transparent and open about that, the less disappointment we cause with that miscommunication.
So when we think about equipment, and also if you read in the book, there'll be lots of information about pretty complex equipment setups to support various elements. But we wanted to go down to the absolute basics. And again, we're talking about working with what you've got. So we basically need to be able to see information. We need to see information coming from the client, and the client needs to see information coming from us. We need a way to share that information. So through internet or video conferencing, camera views, and things like that. And then we also have to have really relevant and appropriate content to share. Just for lack of a better example, it's the difference between sending a whole manual of information to like a really targeted subset of how to program a button on this page. So we just want to be in in control of that content sharing to make sure that we are achieving our goal of effectively communicating in this virtual environment. So to kind of show a picture of what this might look like, we have, in this case, a teacher who is setting up, and this could be the same as a parent in a home environment, or even, you know, on the clinician's end. But here's an example of a pretty big desktop with a built-in camera as well as an external camera. And that's the, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the bendy black camera that's looking over the iPad. And so in this particular example, we're showing how that external camera can help share information about the client's device, the student's device. And we'll talk more about the different scenarios, but in this scenario, they toggle back and forth from the built-in camera showing their face-to-face view to the external camera to be able to show where they might be on the iPad. And that would give the clinician information about what page they're on, maybe why they're running into difficulties, or what words are on there so that they could model more language. And so you can see the exchange of visual information in this example. So just to break that down, we obviously have a display screen, and the size may depend on what you want to share, or the size may restrict what you can share. So in some situations right now, we have families that only have access to a phone. So it would be hard for us to share our video and information at the same time. So it would affect how we share that information. So we might share a video, like a tutorial or a video tutorial before we meet, so that we are only looking face to face when we do meet, because we're talking about a really small screen. Obviously, the more you plan to share, the larger the visual real estate, the visual screen space should be. And just a little note, we always want a backup mode of communication. So if the video doesn't work, or if you somehow can't log in, you are able to have a backup and at least triage or work through that. We also need to use some sort of display software. We are connecting today via Zoom. There are other things like other programs like GoToMeeting or Google Hangout, or there are various options. The most important thing to think about is the security and how security is managed. And we just encourage you to look into those options. That information is available if you look for it. And then to think about Tele-AAC in particular, when you have these video conferencing rooms, obviously the more seats you have can accommodate different views. So you can see me talking right now, but I could also sign in as another user on, you know, my phone or a different device that could give a different camera view and would serve as a seat, but it could maybe show how I'm using it. So these software or conferencing programs that allow multiple seats can allow also different views of the AAC environment. The other thing that is powerful is having recording features so that you can share, or if someone wasn't able to join, they could watch that consult session or intervention session at another time. Again, the caveat being, how is it stored, and make sure it's stored in a secure fashion, but you can look into those things as well. So here's an example of having the cameras. So obviously part of the Tele-AAC environment is to be able to share that visual information either in real time, that synchronous service, or over time. So you can either have one camera or multiple cameras, depending on what you're trying to do. So what you see on your screen right now is that setup I showed you, where they have one computer, but with two views. So the built-in camera for that face-to-face, which we see in the top picture, and that external camera for the view of the AAC system to allow the clinician to toggle back and forth between the two. Whenever possible, you also have a tripod and a way of being hands-free. So just one less thing to contend with.
So when we're talking about software suggestions, so on that previous slide, there's the picture of the two different windows, but then there was also a picture of the book that was being read. And that's actually, I believe, a YouTube video, right, Nerissa, of the book? So when we're talking about the software and complexity, there's a lot of trainings, a lot of resources out there on these fancy apps and bells and whistles that you can use within your tele-session. But we really want to make sure that we're keeping that technology complexity somewhat low so that we're able to really focus on the goal at hand, which is communication and AAC. So you can use pictures and photos, you can use videos. We've done a lot with even just PowerPoint or slideshows or a Word or processing document. There are some interactive websites that you can use to play games or interact. But again, you need to keep into consideration the internet connectivity and the complexity on the screen that you're using. It is important to note, if you're using headphones during that video conferencing, it may affect being able to transmit that audio or the sound effects from your computer to others. So just keep that piece in mind.
So go ahead.
So let's talk about direct synchronous Tele-AAC services. And so again, for synchronous, we're talking about live, in the moment access Tele-AAC services. When we're talking direct, I want you to kind of picture intervention. When we're talking about indirect, it's more consultation. So here in direct, we're picturing that there is an individual that is sitting in front of the computer, and they are accessing the clinician who is presenting material to them. The individual is using their own AAC device. They're able to follow the modeling. They may need some support from a communication partner to keep them on task or facilitate some of that interaction. But this is an individual that's fairly familiar with their communication system. If you had a student that was just starting a communication system, you may move to more of an asynchronous, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. I lied. In a few more slides, we'll talk about that. We would like to give you guys some examples of what the direct synchronous Tele-AAC service looks like. So in this picture, Nerissa has her laptop open, her iPad is running LAMP Words for Life, and it's connected to the computer through QuickTime to do screencasting so that she's able to click on the iPad and navigate through it. So there's slight visual feedback when she accesses buttons on the iPad, but not as much. And you can also see that she's sharing an activity on the screen with the communication partner. I think or with the individual student, sorry. And I believe it's a Legos game. So there's this interactive activity. She also has shrunk the screen that is showing the LAMP Words for Life down so she can still see the individual through the camera. And so that's more of that direct synchronous Tele-AAC session.
So as Hillary mentioned, when we are sharing information on the iPad in that way, our interaction is very subtle. It shows up as like a small highlight on the screen, and that might be hard to follow. So The other thing that you can do is, rather than share the actual AAC screen, you could share your camera on a phone or an iPad, and that can almost serve as a mini projector. What's the major difference in this kind of scenario? It's that you can watch as the person interacts. And for many, that's a really important feature, is to be able to watch how we would work or touch the buttons. It provides a lot more visual feedback. It controls the pace, and we get quite a bit of feedback from participants saying that that was really helpful. The other thing to bear in mind is that, especially with less proficient partners or people that aren't as comfortable with the AAC systems, we kind of take for granted what we know, which is that the menu is right up in the right corner or the bottom left, or you hold the home button to get those things. So it's much more powerful and easier to be able to watch that process and to slow down when we're modeling it. The other thing that we know is aided language stimulation, or AAC modeling, is a really, really important therapeutic technique. And this is a way of being able to provide that if we are thinking about that direct synchronous service time.
Here is a scenario with a lot of technology, which can be very intimidating to many people. But the key with this is that the technology is set up where, in this situation, the individual is pretty independent and doesn't need too much support from that communication partner. So they have their communication device. There's that external camera that's connected to the laptop to allow the clinician to be able to see or put eyes on the AAC device. And then I believe it's an iPad on the other screen, allows that individual to see the clinician as well. We have worked with many of our students in this situation, in this setup, on working on inhibitory behaviors of inhibiting, moving the camera and playing with it as it's next to them. Another strategy is that laptop that is facing the individual, we could turn that around so they're not seeing all of those screens. We know so many of our students love to see themselves on camera, and that can sometimes deter from the task at hand.
And sometimes we need that computer to be able to display an activity. And depending on the program that you're using, you can't always X out the student's or the individual's image paying back to you. So we sometimes just put a piece of paper or stick a piece of paper on the computer. There are some things that we just have to use some old strategies to sort out. So in the example that Hillary talked about, the individual is fairly independent in managing their own technology, as well as, being able to not be too distracted by the tele-technology. But in some instances, we might involve a parent or a communication partner to just help manage that environment. So they might just need a little bit more support from a communication partner on their end. But it's also a very powerful way to see how the two in the on-site environment, the parent and the child, for example, in this situation, are interacting around the device or the system. And what a unique opportunity to really support real-time implementation and training, as to be able to provide the guidance through the parent or a caregiver or a communication partner to work on that AAC system. This scenario is kind of the motivation behind why we really wanted to explore Tele-AAC, is that we found that when we were in the environment, people were very hands-off. They let us do the work. But in this tele environment, we can help them be hands-on and they do the work. And for many of us working with technology, that's how you learn it, is by trying it yourself. So this is also a scenario that can be very powerful in a tele environment.
In that same scenario, it shows the J mount in the picture, which is really helpful with the adjustments. But you could do that same scenario where the parent is using their phone as another seat in the meeting to project their hand moving on the device as well.
Yep, and they could also put that in a tripod or some sort of display that would keep it there so that they could be hands-free and we could still share that same visual information.
This is an example of a direct synchronous Tele-AAC where the individual has some literacy skills, and so they're working off of a simple Word document. This individual, I believe, has their communication device, so it's a dedicated device, and they have it plugged into the computer. You can do this with an iPad as well with a camera connection kit. So here the clinician is able to type in some questions or have a document up there, and the student is responding, and the clinician is getting that visual feedback right from the text that they're entering into the document. So within most video conferencing programs, you're able to share certain screens or certain programs. So you could choose to share just your word processing screen to that student and have that shared remote control where they're able to move that mouse around, they're able to access and input their text just by using their communication device.
And it's an important source of feedback for the clinician too, because oftentimes it's hard to hear that synthesized speech. And so it allows you to also kind of see it and provide that visual feedback on your end as well. And if you're also familiar with the system that the individual is using, you can get a sense of where they are within their system based on what words they're inputting. But sometimes we find that visual feedback is really helpful with the auditory component in the virtual environment.
And just the engagement piece on the individual's end, that what they're saying, they're also seeing on the screen.
Yeah. So in some ways, this is kind of the most intensive of the scenarios, in the sense that on both the clinician's end and the client's end, they can not only see each other, they can also see their systems. So this is oftentimes really hard to replicate in our current scenario, but not impossible, as Hillary mentioned, with cell phones or multiple seats. So you can certainly create a similar environment. So in this example, we have the client and the clinician. The clinician has an AAC system on which she is modeling, and the client has his own system in which he's, following that model, and they're talking about the book that's displayed on the screen. So the number one thing here is really the ability of the individual to be able to take that model and convert it into their own AAC use. So it's not only being able to follow a model, but take a model from that environment to their own system. Certainly some can do that and some can't, but you can also picture that there could be a communication partner next to the student that's helping with the interaction.
So when we're looking at the direct synchronous Tele-AAC service, the equipment can vary dramatically or just slightly for each of the different scenarios. We are really starting with what equipment, after we do that, the survey and see the candidacy of the environment and of the individual, that can really vary across. But we're able to use that direct synchronous Tele-AAC to show how to use the device, how to provide modeling, and really able to see how that individual is doing with that, the AAC system on their end as well.
So when we shift to asynchronous, that service over time, it's helpful to think about that flipped classroom approach of I give you information, I share it, or I assign you something to try, you complete it, share back to me, and then we talk about it. And the order in which it happens can absolutely vary. But this is important to consider. Well, first of all, it can be very powerful. In our experiences right now, where people are homebound and not able to, are managing a lot and are also responsible for the learning of their children, to try to meet at a scheduled time is pretty tricky. Especially to try to meet at a scheduled time with their child. So we found that this asynchronous access, at some point they can expect information that is carefully tailored to them, that is visual and representative. They can then try it and then share back to us about what worked, what didn't work. Maybe they take a video of how they tried it, and then we can troubleshoot in that way over time. So the fancy term is store and forward. So I'm going to store some information and I'm going to forward it. And then we can meet about it if we need to. And some benefits are that we can really control the pace. We can be really targeted, so we can focus just on a specific skill, because we could almost do multiple mini sessions if we need to. And it can also help build up tolerance, as we mentioned before, to that virtual environment. So maybe we can't engage and sustain or maintain attention and focus for the entire length of time. And do we even really know what the optimal amount of time is? Or is this a way to kind of just build successful sharing of AAC related information? The other thing is that it can also potentially help more widespread implementation. So picture if we send a video of how we would use our AAC system at mealtime or when playing a game, and then maybe the whole family can watch it and get ideas from it. So that sharing of information can be very powerful in the sense that other people can also be part of that process.
So here's an example of the direct asynchronous Tele-AAC. And I think one of, like Nerissa said, the powerful pieces is the ability to pace it. And so a parent can watch a video that has been sent to them previously before watching it in front of the student, so they can get materials or kind of be mentally prepared for what the expectations are going to be. They can, sometimes the clinician may record an expectation or a task for the student to do, and then they can record them doing the task and send it back to the clinician so that their next kind of check-in or consult time, they're able to give more specific feedback or refine the expectation of the task and review that video in the moment with the communication partner and say, "Ooh, I really liked how you did this at this point," or being able to give very explicit feedback for that session that the communication partner had recorded and sent back to the clinician to review.
And not that different in this example, and I think Hillary even just mentioned that, the power of sharing back video clips or of the moment in action, allowing the clinician to see what's happened or how it's being used, again, can be very, very powerful and can make that real-time connection that much more effective. You can also do this with basically any information. So maybe someone shares a little what's the word, language sample. So maybe you ask them to collect information about what's talked about, you know, during that morning time when you're all, you know, everyone's kind of chatty, or the individual has the most amount of energy after a good night's sleep. And we can, you know, they could share the language sample, we could talk about it, get some ideas, and then make some suggestions for modifying that. We've also talked about using LAM data and getting a sense of when are those frequencies, when do we see the most use, and how can we, you know, elaborate on that and bring in more opportunities like that. So it's this sharing of relevant information and then providing appropriate feedback based on what we get.
We were just talking with one of our teachers of the visually impaired the other day, and she had suggested talking to the family about taking their phone around the house with them to videotape what toys the student had in their playroom or what they had access to around the house, to help brainstorm what materials they could use for communication or different activities to work with the family. And that was a really successful kind of strategy for the parents that were open to it and had their houses all perfectly cleaned and organized prior to the video tour.
Video tour. A virtual tour of the house.
Yes, yes, great idea.
So this asynchronous model, really, I think the bottom line is it comes down to something that can be very powerful, very flexible. Picture that flipped classroom idea, sharing of that relevant information. And it sometimes makes, you know, if you think about even just a, you know, the face-to-face time, when if you do make the time to connect, you're now able to, rather than saying, so tell me how it went, or when did you use the AAC system, or did you play it with games? Now we can go right to, you know, I watched what you did when you played Guess Who, or when you were playing that Uno card game, and I love how you worked on these words. Now with we could consider adding these words next time you play. So you can kind of just enter the direct, that face-to-face time with a lot of really relevant information. And as we keep on saying, with any of these virtual environments, they can always be recorded, or someone can kind of zoom in. And we've kind of talked about Zoom has taken a whole new, become a different part of our vocabulary now, and can join in on that. So maybe, you know, it's important for other family members to know, or another clinician or a teacher to hear that information. So it can be a very, very effective service delivery method.
So on the other side of it, if we think of indirect, or more of that consultation type role, we can think of that in synchronous or asynchronous. And so first we're going to talk about it, that consultation synchronous. So having that live support for the communication partner. What's exciting about this with the Tele is, as Nerissa said, during the direct services, you can pull in other clinicians. So you could pull in a physical therapist, or an occupational therapist, rehab therapist, or teacher of the visually impaired, and help kind of collaborate all together with that communication partner. You can still use those same kind of features of sharing your screen, doing screencasting, and being able to use that camera as a projector to kind of model and talk that communication partner through navigating the communication device, doing some programming, or how do you talk them through uploading their LAM data that they've collected so that you're able to share it, or even pulling that up on your desktop to share with everybody, to really say, okay, where is it working? Where can we maybe add to it? What is the vocabulary they're using, and how can we kind of target increasing those different features of it?
And so the main distinction here is that it's really to the team rather than directly to the individual, but it's not necessarily that it's a real time versus an overtime. So it's that supporting the circle around the individual. So when we think about kind of real-time consultation, so real-time, or, you know, synchronous services, just like we've talked about with the direct services to the individual, it occurs live in the moment, may include just a communication partner or a team of people, could include other individuals. The individual may be present if they want to, but it's really about targeting the support around them. And it, can be about anything that supports generalization and implementation of AAC. So, how do we model? How do we use different forms of prompting? How do we incorporate visuals? How do we play a game with AAC? How do we troubleshoot a programming challenge? Or how do we program something new? So it is a very broad set of things that we can talk about. So this real-time consult, so in this example here, we're screen sharing an iPad, and the point being that we now have a dynamic visual to reference about what we're talking. So we are, able to kind of see what we're talking about because we're not in the same environment. So we can't both be looking at the device and being like, oh yes, this one over here, over here. We're now replicating that in this virtual environment, and creating a shared visual representation so that we know what we're talking about. And again, other team members can tune in. So in this particular example, I'm communicating with a parent, and her school-based speech pathologist has tuned into the session, and it's being recorded so that the outpatient clinical speech pathologist can watch it when she's not in a session, because she, at the time of this meeting, was seeing a different patient. And again, the powerful part being that you can see what you're talking about. And just quickly, just an add-on is that you can also use annotation because in the screen sharing capabilities in Zoom and other programs, you can annotate over that screen. So we were talking about what words to put where and all that kind of stuff.
Here's an example of indirect synchronous Tele-AAC just on a phone, kind of on the go. There was an issue with the Bluetooth interface, and so the clinician was able to get eyes on the situation and help them troubleshoot through it.
Having those eyes, it allows you to respond much more quickly.
And more efficiently when you're able to say, no, push the one next to the one you're touching, when you're able to see what they're doing. Here's a scenario, lots of technology. We were doing some mounting, and so we had used the phone video conferencing to be able to provide the PT and OT kind of visual access to where the mounting system was going while targeting, kind of trialing different devices at that time. It was helpful to have it remotely. One clinician was sick and was able to, again, be present without sharing their germs and give us the feedback on the different vocabulary as we were setting that up.
So similarly, it can be very flexible. Something that is also powerful to think about when we're talking about this going now into asynchronous, that over time service, we have a little bit more flexibility with that scheduling. So the expectation is not that we meet at the same time, but that rather I share information, you do something with it, and then we connect. And you're seeing kind of a repetition here. So just as we've talked about with the other stuff, it's sharing information, visual information, and getting that information back from the team in some way, shape, or form. And it's a very similar concept to that video modeling. So I'm going to demonstrate or video a skill to share with you to learn from, and then you're going to give me some information back. We can't emphasize enough, there's some we kind of take for granted what we lose in the on-site world. There's a lot about the context and the environment that informs our understanding. So when we are generating these tools and resources to share, it's important to be very specific and directives. So we try to encourage teams, rather than necessarily pulling a generic resource, spend a few minutes, can be very easy, use your phone, take a screencast or a voiceover as you demonstrate the skill, because it's targeted, specific, and direct for the individual with what you're focusing on. And we want to be really making sure we support their attention to what we're very explicit and direct about what information we're sharing in this virtual arrangement.
So these are just some examples of the screencasts or the videos that we've taken to troubleshoot with families, where they'll take a video of what's going on, send it to us, and we can troubleshoot or give some ideas of programming or vocabulary within that. We've also done this with individuals who are speaking another language, and being able to really use the screenshots with numbers, numbering the steps, or doing a lot of nonverbal communication through the videos or photos to help support that understanding.
So just things to consider when you are in a virtual environment. We just touched on it, but that engagement, it's different. We need to give it a little bit of attention. So it might be, as I just mentioned, that really targeted information or the numbers to really point out, because we can't do the same thing as kind of, sharing something, and we have to kind of replicate that sharing ability. If we are working directly with an individual, we may need some behavior modifications, so some schedules or just something to help plan our time, because we don't have as much contextual and physical content, so we might contact with the individual, so we might need to kind of create that in how we construct our virtual environment. And again, going back to that focusing and attention. So maybe in annotation software, you highlight or circle the area that you want them to attend to, and then you help shift their attention to the next area. So just things to consider in a virtual environment.
We've created some must-dos for our communication partners to help with that engagement in the tele environment. And it's so important to just have clear expectations of that communication partner prior to initiating that session, so that they know what their role is. They know to kind of decrease that side conversation because it's going to distract the student, and to try to stay as positive as possible, knowing that the technology may be a bit annoying or flustered. We want to keep that positive idea of it in front of the individual we're working with.
So, yep, just briefly on this slide, just not to forget the fundamentals of AAC practice, either providing resources and information about prompting and variable prompting, and going from like a most to least and a least to most, and that modeling. And as we talked about, you can demonstrate modeling by using technology in different ways. So those are really important.
On the end of the clinician, strategies for increasing that engagement is having motivating and engaging tasks, trying to keep your language very succinct and to the point, so there's not too much of it. Remembering that prompting, including that the wait time, and when we're doing interaction through tele, add another 3 seconds to your wait time, because you're going to need it in that setting. Using visuals, keeping a routine, being okay with keeping it short and ending on a positive note. We can't stress that enough. And then build up to their tolerance and success in that tele session.
And then just taking into consideration the technology and the sizes, as we've talked about, and just little tricks, the difference of being in portrait versus landscape mode, and how that affects the visual, we call it visual real estate, and how that, the display. So those are just important things to think about. And then if the individual doesn't have their AAC system at home or in their environment, we have this a lot because it was kind of a really unexpected shutdown on our end. You can share images, or even if you share a PDF of a screenshot, they can open it on an iPad and it can simulate a system. So language boards and visuals are powerful things that can also recreate or replicate the AAC.
Just some tips for when doing Tele-AAC. We've found it's more helpful to choose to share your whole desktop versus an individual program at times, because you're able to show a language board and a slideshow and still see the individual. Nerissa already mentioned the landscape, and trying to share your screen, different ways of sharing your screen on the iPad to emulate or access some of the apps that are available there. When you are using more than one device, so if you have your camera, your phone that you're using as a projector for the device in one seat, and you have your laptop that you're presenting the activity on, make sure that you're muting your phone you're using as a camera, or you're going to get this ear-piercing, terrible sound. So please remember to mute those. And then just thinking about when to use gallery mode view, where everybody can see everybody and you can see those camera and that projection phone, and when you might want to just do speakerphone as a way of helping the individuals shift their attention back and forth.